This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-host, Estalia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. If you like ours, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is part of a series generously sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which includes a focus on global affairs and the international world order.
And we're very pleased to welcome today Steven Zipperstein. He is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University. He has taught at universities in Russia, Poland, France, and in Israel. Zipperstein is the author and editor of 9 books. His work has been translated into Russian, Hebrew, and French. He is the recipient of numerous awards over the years. He's published extensively also in the mainstream media. And together with Anita Shapira, he's the series editor of the Yale University Press Leon Black Foundation Jewish Lives volumes. We'll be discussing his latest book, Pogrom, Kishinev and the Tilt of History, published by Liverite W.W. Norton in 2018. It's a highly acclaimed book, and we're very happy to welcome Steven Zipperstein to the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let's just start with the basic facts. Why did the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 acquire such a mythical status in the Jewish imagination?
Much of my book is about the interplay between basic facts and what's actually remembered about those facts. So it's really a study of how difficult it is to actually remember basic facts. But a riot breaks out on Easter Day in April 1903, killing 47 Jews. 2 others die of wounds incurred during the pogrom. Many women are raped. Number 40 are documented, but probably many more are raped. Many stores are broken into. The riot lasts for about a day and a half, 2 days, and it becomes the emblem for what pogroms are in much of the Jewish world and beyond, though fewer Jews are killed in this pogrom than in many others in Romanov Russia, which falls, of course, in 1917. This becomes the quintessence of what a pogrom is for a wide variety of reasons that I try to open up in the book.
Yeah, let's take them one by one.
I want to actually back up a little bit, because there's just to introduce the, I think, the main thesis of your book, if there is such a thing as a thesis to it, because it's really a matter of how we read history. I want to start with a quote, and I really rarely do this. It's not a quote, it's a quote from your book, but not your quote, but a quote of somebody else's book. "The time and the place are the only thing I'm certain of. Beyond that is the haze of history and pain." The opening lines of The Lazarus Project, a novel linked to this event by Alexander Himon. And I want to talk about what is the haze of history and pain that emerges from this. You went through the basic facts. Why or how do you characterize this, big cloud that arises from the memory of this pogrom?
Well, that's what came to intrigue me. I originally started writing a different book. I had signed a contract with a trade publisher, not the trade publisher that I eventually published with, to write a cultural history of all of Russian East European Jewry from the late 18th century to the present, and just in order to try to best ensure that I didn't suffer from constant insomnia, I subdivided the book into sections. And one section was the Kishinev pogrom, which I knew loomed large, but had little sense at the time as to why. And that's when what prompted me to tear up the original contract and to write this book, because what I came to discover was, while on the one hand, this was, for a whole variety of reasons that we can talk about, the best documented event in the Russian Jewish past, it ended up also being the most mythologized event. And that interplay between facts that were knowable and what was made of the event seemed to just reveal so much about how history is made, shaped, and remembered, and seemed to also offer a unique entree into the consolidation of the contemporary Jewish imagination, and also the ways in which Jews are thought about by others. So that was the backdrop to the event. What really prompted me to write the book was an event that I don't write about all that extensively in the book. It just didn't fit. What I came to learn very early on, I started reading through the transcripts of the Second Party Congress of the Social Democratic Party, the Marxist Party in Russia. And their Second Party Congress occurs in the summer of 1903, and it really isn't the Second Party Congress. It's really the first. The first meeting was a meeting of a few Jews, I think, in Minsk, but it sounded better to call it a Second Party Congress. And so it occurs in the summer of 1903. It's a long meeting. It starts in Brussels, ends up in London, long speeches. And it's the meeting where Lenin is able to consolidate his hold, his organizational hold on Russian Marxism, winning one crucial vote about the organization of the party, and consequently his group emerging as the Bolsheviks, which means those of the majority. He loses all sorts of subsequent votes, but is able to hold on to the term. And he's able to do this, as he realizes he's extraordinarily savvy, because he marginalizes the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund and basically makes it inevitable for its 5 members to walk out of the meeting, and thus he can secure a majority. He's able to do so because the Bund won't go along with the idea of a centralized party in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom, because it wants to retain its autonomy to defend Jews. But as an internationalist organization, it can't actually say out loud that it's intent on defending Jews. And Lenin knows that basically it's fighting with its hands tied behind its back because it's mesmerized, it's fixated on the implications of the Kishinev pogrom. So once I realized that the Kishinev pogrom was actually the ether in the room in the most formative Marxist meeting in Russian history before the 1917 revolution, I realized there was a story to tell. And that, in the end, is what persuaded me to start this book and to turn my back on the other book.
But why Kishinev? I mean, it's not like the situation of the Jews in Russia had not been volatile for decades before. And also, as you said earlier, it wasn't by far the deadliest pogrom of them all. Why was it such a turning point in the way, Jewish life, both in Russia and later in the West, and later, throughout the 20th century is imagined?
I just want to add that when I was preparing for this and I was talking to some Israeli friends and I said we were going to be talking about Kishinev, and somebody said, remind me how many people died? And I said, nearly 50. And the person said, that's all? That's an Israeli who grew up here and was taught about it as looming larger than everything else.
Of course. Part of it had to do with when it occurs. At the turn of the 20th century and the beginning of a century that is presumed to be a century of peace. We can say that with some degree of irony, but that's how it was ushered in. Part of it has to do with where it occurs. It occurs in an area just at the southwestern edge of the Russian Empire, with the most porous of all borders and the most bribable of all officials, and consequently, it's the easiest area to actually send news out from Russia to the Western world. It ends up looming large, partly and ironically, because of the relatively small number of Jews who were killed. 47 Jews, and 47 are murdered at the outset. Pictures of them are taken, and you could actually photograph 47 dead bodies and capture all of them in a photograph. You can't do that with the 600 or 800 bodies that are slaughtered in Odessa a couple of years later in October 1905. And so, to some extent, typologically, not dissimilar from the way in which Anne Frank becomes the emblem of the Holocaust, because you can better conceive of the death of one girl than you can conceive of the death of millions. The Kishinev pogrom, which is the first Jewish tragedy in to be captured with the use of photographs. Photographs are expensive, but they're used now in this instance. And these photographs capture an enormous imagination. But more so, it's because all of the Jewish political organizations at the time, and in 1903, all of them are at their height. Herzl dies the next year in 1904. The Jewish Socialist Labor Bund is very powerful in 1903. It will wane in significance after the Russian Revolution of 1905, 1906. They all build the Kishinev pogrom into their institutional memory. And so it's an event that ends up being consolidated across the entire otherwise fractious spectrum of Jewish life.
You know, there's two major chronological themes in a way. One is what led up to the pogrom, and then what happened after it. And in a way, your book reads in a very narrative sense, almost like a novel, and there's characters. And I'm curious about some of the characters who were behind the planning and execution, or were mythologized as being behind the planning and execution. Can you tell us about some of them? Let's start maybe with Pavel Krushevan, who is such a critical part of the story. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, well, I ended up learning a fair amount about Pavel Krushevan, partly because just as I was finishing the book, I ended up discovering an archive that was in private hands that offered a fuller portrait of who the man was. And so the area that the pogrom breaks out in is an agricultural area. Kishinev itself is a kind of, it functions in a way similar to Fresno in California as the kind of urban center of a vast agricultural area. Very few factories, and those factories in Kishinev basically are processing agricultural goods by and large. But it's also the epicenter, for a whole variety of reasons, of some of the most ferociously far-right figures in Russian life. And Krushevan, who's an erstwhile liberal who becomes committed to far-right politics at the end of the 19th century, and a few years before the outbreak of the Kishinev pogrom, edits a ferociously anti-Semitic newspaper, the only real newspaper in the region. And he and a clutch of others, and we can identify the names of several others, are at work before the outbreak of the Kishinev pogrom on a book that will demonstrate that Jews control the world. Control the world's media, control the world's politics. A work, the first version of the work that will come to be known a little bit later as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He's the first publisher of what will be known as the Protocols. He publishes it soon after the Kishinev pogrom in a newspaper he owns in Petersburg. And Krushevan and a small group of others, it seems fairly clear plan the pogrom. But I'll return to Krushevan in a moment. But what I came to learn, I think, about the nature of the kind of events that erupted so violently in Kishinev is that Jewish attitudes, even in late imperial Russia, where anti-Semitism was rife, Jewish attitudes actually are made of a medley of feelings, an interplay between admiration and enmity, and a lot in the middle. A lot of what Russians might have thought about Jews say, about Jewish economic capacity could be seen in admirable terms or in derogatory terms. The capacity of Jews to resist alcohol, by and large, could be seen as an admirable quality or a suspicious quality. It really takes ideologues or political figures to consolidate otherwise inchoate feelings about Jews. And that's what occurs, I think, in the immediate backdrop to the outbreak of violence in Kishinev. And the entire city doesn't explode. Fewer than 1,000 people, which is a large number, are engaged in attacks on Jews in a city of 100,000, where about half the population is Jewish. But what Khrushchev and others are able to do is to manipulate the mix so that there's sufficient suspicion and enmity for the outbreak to occur. Khrushchev himself, as I came to learn, was an immensely more complicated person than was known at the time. I was able to discover a diary that he kept when he was 15 or 16.
Because you're right, Steve, that the connection to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was not well known before, that this is really a revelation that you stumbled upon.
Well, a number of scholars have been working on this, and a very distinguished Italian Slavicist, one or two very, very good German historians have been publishing on this for some time. But I was able to pull the story together, and then with the use of this new material that I found about Khrushchev that was in private hands, I was able to fill out the story of his life. Khrushchev now, in contemporary Moldova and in the region near it, has come to be seen as a hero of anti-capitalism, anti-Westernism, homophobia, anti-feminism. And what the diary and the other material that I discovered reveals is that he was a closeted homosexual. At the age of 15, 16, he was having sex with a Cossack of the male persuasion, and writes in his diary that he wishes he was born a lady. And so the passions that he wrestled with and that he felt were taking him over when he was an adolescent seemed to mesh with the hatred that eventually surfaces in him.
So you see, one's tempted to think that if had only he been born at a different time when these were not repressed feelings, everything might have been different.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier that this was the first event of this kind in Russia that was widely covered in the Western media, and you said that it was also due to technical reasons, that it was relatively easy to leak information out to the Western world. But also, do you think that it signifies some sort of cultural change in the propensity of Western audience to this kind of information?
Yeah, it's part of the story has to do with the way in which the full range of Jewish institutions and political organizations are invested in the story. Part of the story has to do with the impact of the press and with the particular interest that Hearst, then a very powerful newspaper man with keen political aspirations, the amount of energy that he invested in the event. He's the publisher of basically newspapers like the National Enquirer, or some of the kind of sensationalist sheets that you have that are given out free in the corner of downtown Tel Aviv. And he invests heavily in publicizing this event as an event that the Russian government itself is responsible for, and sends an ace reporter to Kishinev, Michael David, who is a well-known Irish revolutionary, to cover the event. David publishes an instant book a few months later. That's the first best-selling book on the Jews of Russia in any Western language. And so it's an event that really captures the attention of much of the world. But what captures the attention even more so, about a month after the pogrom, is a letter signed by the Minister of Interior, Pleve, that acknowledges that the Russian government planned the pogrom. And the letter is widely publicized. It's discussed in the American Congress, and it really serves as the kind of primary proof that that Russian Jews are being hounded, killed, raped on the streets of the empire. And it's this letter that constitutes the major reason why there's relatively open immigration of Jews from the Russian Empire up until the First World War and really up until the 1920s. And it turns out the letter's a fake. It's a forgery.
And not just a forgery, but responsible for one of the reigning sort of mythical understandings of the pogrom. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. The letter was written, no doubt, by someone who truly believed that if Pleva was tied to a chair in the way that a character from Homeland might be tied to a chair and interrogated, this is what he would admit to have done. But the letter was not written by Pleva. And in some ways, the Pleva letter typologically functions similarly to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The authors of what would come to be known as the Protocols no doubt truly believed that if Jews were permitted to admit their aspirations, this is what they would say, but they were simply putting words into the mouth of the so-called elder of the Jews. And both documents end up consolidating memory of the pogrom far more powerfully than the actual events of the pogrom themselves. And then there's that other extraordinarily powerful document that's part of the rubble of the Kishinev pogrom, and that's Chaim Nachman Bialik's Bir HaRaga.
That was exactly my next question. I think that it's a very interesting juxtaposition between a journalist who was on the ground reporting in real time, observing everything, and wrote a factual, immediate historical book afterwards. But the poem that far overshadowed it is a creative literary product by Bialik. And so I'd be curious, how do you assess the impact of a creative literary memorialization of Kishinev rather than the fact that the work of history, which really has barely survived. I mean, I can't say I was familiar with David's book. In other words, we haven't really remembered the documentation. We've recalled the creative product. Tell us why you think Bialik's book so overshadowed everything else and how it then played out.
Well, the simple answer to that is because Bialik is Bialik, right?
But was Bialik always Bialik? Was he Bialik before City of Slaughter?
He was certainly highly regarded in the small hothouse of Hebrew literature. He becomes Bialik, and there you're absolutely right, in the wake of the writing of Bir HaRaga. So part of the reason for its impact is simply because of its intrinsic brilliance. And it's an extraordinary work and draws on the full range of Hebrew imagery, biblical, post-biblical. It's a work that seeks to capture something about the essence of Jewish exilic life, and in a way that is really unforgettable. And it's a work that meshes with contemporary Zionist thought in the late 19th, early 20th century, that believes that there's something fundamentally subversive about Jewish life in exile, and crucial about the reconstruction of Jewish life elsewhere, hopefully in Palestine. And at the same time, what I came to discover that while the poem ignores almost everything that Bialik learns in Kishinev, Bialik is actually sent as someone to record the events of pogrom sufferers and witnesses. He spends 5 weeks in Kishinev, goes there a few weeks after the end of the pogrom, sits with an assistant, takes transcripts from countless Jews in Yiddish. The work is translated into Hebrew. His notes contain copious examples of Jews fighting off pogromists, in some cases, Jews in organized groups as large as 150 and 200, Jews who've sequestered guns and used guns to resist pogromists. And he collects these testimonies. They're all translated, and then they're locked away for 50, 60 years, and nobody sees them.
Including, I should say, I just want to break in, including a lot of documentation of rape, which is not truly part of the narrative afterwards. Is that right?
Right. And then
Right.
he sits in his father-in-law's house and he writes this brilliant poem. And it's this that ends up consolidating the memory of the pogrom for Jewish readers more so than any other document. A year later, it's translated into Russian by the pre-revisionist Zionist Vladimir Jabotinsky into a gorgeous Russian translation that's recited by Zionists as well as non-Zionists during the revolution of 1905, 1906. And at the epicenter of the poem is not the humiliated and raped women, and not as much the killing of Jews as much as is the cowering Jewish men who hide while their sisters or mothers, their wives are being raped. And at its epicenter is an attack on the cowardice of exilic Jewish men who could only be in a culture that could only be reshaped in Eretz Israel. And what I did discover is while the poem is profoundly selective in its depiction of what occurs in a Kishinev pogrom, what I did find was that Michael David, who I mentioned earlier, who was a meticulous newspaper person and took copious notes, I was able to track his notes back to Trinity College, Dublin. And in looking through his notes, Michael David says exactly the same thing about Jewish males who admitted to him, as many as 100 admitted to him that they had hid away as their loved ones were being raped. He says the same exact thing that Bialik says. And so what I conclude in the book is that obviously Bialik tells a highly, highly selective story, but Michael David never actually published this information. He left it in his notes and never wrote about it in his articles or in his subsequent book about the Kishinev pogrom. What I concluded was that Bialik, in writing a poem, felt that he could include this precisely because it wasn't a reportage. And he was telling something about a beleaguered people who, precisely because they're beleaguered and vulnerable, tend to hide their most shameful stories. And what I came to learn in the end is that when you speak about historical events, you inevitably speak with equivocation. On the one hand, this was an event of incredible violence. And at the same time, large numbers of Jews felt comfortable running into the homes of non-Jews in order to escape attacks and felt confident that they would be hidden. And so it's an event of great violence and anti-Jewish enmity. And at the same time, it's impossible to generalize that it's in a place where there's widespread enmity toward Jews. What I came to conclude was that history is full of pockmarks and equivocations. You begin to stutter when you describe an historical event that you know well. Myth is immeasurably more coherent. And in an American context, if you will, history sounds like Jeb Bush, and myth sounds like Trump. Yeah. And myth you could capture in a Twitter. I finished this book before the now ubiquitous use of the term fake news, but in many ways it is a book about fake news. It's a book about the incredible allure of myth and the coherence of myth, the persuasiveness of myth over the utter messiness of facts.
I want to ask you about one of the points you just raised where, you were explaining that history never being so neat, this was a moment of incredible violence against Jews, but at the same time, some Jews felt comfortable and thought they were safer with their neighbors. In many ways, this was a bout of violence between people who were quite intimate with one another. You write of women who knew their rapists, people who were killed by people they had known, even Khrushchev himself, you say, grew up surrounded by Jews. And this reminds me of several other, works that explore this concept of violence among people who know one another. Of course, Jan Gross's Neighbors, and we've had Jeffrey Kopstein on the show for his book, Intimate Violence. It also reminds me of that opening quote by Alexander Hamon, because he himself, of course, was a refugee from the Bosnian War, which was the quintessential modern example of neighbors killing neighbors. Is that another lesson of history? Is that when people live together, they invariably turn on each other at some point? Or can you offer something even remotely more optimistic than that?
Not invariably, because there were many instances, not just a few instances, of Jews feeling that they could run into the homes of non-Jews unannounced and be saved.
And they were right in that case, in some cases.
And they're right. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I haven't come across any instance where a Jew was actually turned away and escaping into the home of a non-Jewish neighbor who they considered to be a friend. On the other hand, what you're saying is absolutely right, and I'm not sure that I'm able to explain it. I don't know that Jan Gross in his brilliant book was able to explain it either, and that's not a failing of the book. It's familiarity can result in the worst violence, and I think we encounter that time and again. You spoke about some of the aspects of my book being similar to that of a novel, and I'm aware of that. And historians, in contrast to political scientists, don't feel the need, and I'm not scanting the importance of political science. It's certainly a crucial way of understanding the world. We don't feel the need to actually produce theory in the wake of what it is that we describe. And I'm not sure that I'm able to theorize about why it is that familiarity has the capacity of breeding outsized violence. And I certainly was able to find sufficient evidence of that in the writing of this book, much as Jan Gross did in Neighbors. So, why it is that someone who knows another person, in one instance, someone who wreaked violence and perhaps even murdered a relative, was a man whose shoes or sandals were fixed by a shoemaker whose house he then attacked during the pogrom. In the instance, I think that you've cited, a woman recognized that she had actually breastfed as an infant a young man who then, during the pogrom, attacked and raped her. So why it is that kind of intimacy could lead to intimate violence, I think that's a term used in the Kopelstein book, is something that I'm able to record, but I'm not able to explain.
Well, I just want to correct it because Gilad has the next question. But just to correct, I really shouldn't have said invariably leads. What I guess I meant was it offers no necessary protection against later conflict and violence.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, Gilad, did I insult political scientists?
No, quite the contrary. I wanted to ask you perhaps one last question, because we will have to wrap up soon. What do you think is the place of Kishinev in the post-World War II imagination? Because in a way, if I can put it crudely, Kishinev was Auschwitz before Auschwitz, right? Auschwitz is now the emblem of anti-Jewish violence, which Kishinev, as you point out, its role that it played before the Second World War. What is really the ongoing legacy of Kishinev?
I mean, I suppose what I might be asked is its counter legacy. And what I document or seek to document in my book is the heavy weight left in the wake of Kishinev that shaped so much of what Jews in the last century and non-Jews thought about Jews, to the extent to which my book seeks to answer your question. It's to raise the possibility of perhaps freeing us from some of that weight and recognizing the ways in which so much of what we as Jews and others have thought about the Jewish past is shaped inordinately out of mythology rather than what has occurred, and that perhaps taking the events of history, the events around us, with all their complexity more seriously, that could lead us to more clear-headed decisions. And so while the book has no overt political aim, I suppose it has somewhat more subterranean political aims, so that so much of it seeks to some extent, clear the air. And in one recent review of the book that I noticed, this woman writes about how she had assumed that her grandmother came from a town called Pogrom because all that she described about the past was that pogrom. And once perhaps we recognize that pogroms did not inundate our past in the way in which we assume that Gentiles were not forever inimical, that we might be able to understand the past somewhat differently, then perhaps the fog that accompanies so much of that fogs our glasses and our perspective on the world might make for a somewhat clearer perspective on the present day too. So to some extent, I suppose, the book for me and what I hoped for readers would provide a kind of exorcism. And that's how I think I would at least initially respond to your question, Gillian.
Well, I think we have an optimistic direction for a wrap-up question, which is that if you are sort of clearing up the fog about history, can we also find some positive outlook in the impact that the events had in the U.S.? I mean, you talk about them actually as a sort of galvanizing moment for some of the other beleaguered and besieged communities in America, other immigrant groups, Chinese Americans, even the emerging and early stage civil rights interest of Jews on behalf of the African American community. Could that be a legacy as well? That a terrible moment galvanizes us to find solidarity?
Yeah, what I discovered, and I didn't really know anything about this before working on the book, was how Kishinev actually serves as an inspiration for what one could call intersectional politics. And it's the Russian regime that actually first insists that, in contrast to the way in which Russia is being described in the Western and especially the American press as a place of oppression, that one should bear in mind that African Americans, that blacks, then called Negroes, are being oppressed in the United States far more so, the Russian officials say, than Jews in the Russian Empire. And this encourages a thinking about the connections between the way in which blacks are spoken about in America, lynching is described in America, and pogroms are in Russia. And it's an unusual, now largely forgotten couple, and above all, a woman named Anna Strunsky, I'm happy to say a Stanford graduate, who actually ends up inspiring the serious talk about the connection between pogroms in Russia, typological connection between pogroms in Russia and lynching in the United States. And it's she who comes up with the initial idea of what comes to be the NAACP, established in 1909. As is all too frequent in the history of women in history, she ends up being largely forgotten. Her husband is chosen as the chair or co-chair, the first co-chair of the NAACP. He's seen as the founder of the NAACP, not her. And the last picture in my book is actually a picture of her, because to the extent to which, while writing this book about violence, I fell at least obliquely in love, it was with my portrait of her, and just wanted to sort of highlight her importance in actually shaping history and in shaping a crucial chapter in the history of civil rights in the United States. So that's, I suppose, a happy byproduct of the story. There's, I think, one of the most moving moments for me, I admit, in just wrestling with what's important and not important in history. Anna Strunsky is constantly writing, but unable to publish. And there was a manuscript of hers called on revolutionary figures that I found at the archives in Yale, and scrawled on the bottom of the various pages in pencil were notes from her children talking about how much they love their mother, which raised all sorts of questions about what's actually truly important in life, the shaping of books, the shaping of politics, or the shaping of joyous children who are happy living side by side with their mother.
I am so happy we asked that last question.
Yeah, it's a great way to wrap up this interview. Professor Steven Zipperstein, thank you very much for joining us today and talking to us about your latest book, Pogrom, Kishinev and the Tales of History. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And also many thanks to Itai Shalem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this series. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has almost 600 interviews, if not more. I don't know. We haven't counted recently. And you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Dalia on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me and from Dalia, goodbye.